Looking ahead, it's pretty wild to think that two of the biggest global events the U.S. is set to host are just around the corner.
Yeah, the 2026 FIFA World Cup and then the 2028 Summer Olympics in LA.
Exactly. I mean, these aren't just sporting events. They're these massive moments really designed to bring the world together.
They really are, peak moments of international sport, culture. They rely on people being able to travel, basically, from everywhere.
Totally. But, looking at the sources you shared these articles notes there's this kind of tricky question hanging over them, isn't there?
You mean how the U.S. travel ban policy fits in?
Right, exactly. The one implemented under President Trump, targeting that list of countries. How does that square up with hosting events that, fundamentally depend on opening your doors?
It's a definite point of tension. The whole spirit is universal participation, right? And a policy like that seems, well, almost the opposite.
It does. So in this deep dive, we're going to unpack these sources you brought, really try and get to grips with this potential clash. Like, what is the policy? Who does it affect? How might it actually hit athletes and fans? What are the organizers, FIFA, LA28 doing? And maybe what can we learn from past events?
Sounds good.
Our mission really is just to pull out those key insights, the stuff that explains what's going on. Let's dive in.
Okay, so based on these sources, let's start with the policy itself. These travel restrictions, sometimes called the travel ban, they specifically bar or, significantly limit entry for citizens from a specific list of countries.
And that list, according to the material here, it's, 12 countries with pretty much full bans. Afghanistan, Myanmar, Chad.
Congo, Equatorial Guinea, Eritrea, Haiti, Iran, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Yemen. Those are the main ones.
Plus tighter restrictions on another 7. Burundi, Cuba, Laos, Sierra Leone, Togo, Turkmenistan, Venezuela. So, yeah, citizens from 19 nations facing some kind of restriction.
That's the scope, yeah. And the stated reasons from the government, as detailed in the sources, it was mostly about concerns over what they called deficient screening processes in those countries.
Right. Or issues with countries not taking back their citizens deported from the U.S. That was part of it too, wasn't it?
That's in there as well, yes. Concerns about vetting and cooperation.
Okay, so that's the policy framework, targeting these countries for those stated reasons. Now, the core question, how does this bump up against the World Cup and the Olympics?
Well, yeah, because as the sources point out, some of these nations actually have pretty competitive teams.
Like Iran, right. Major soccer presence in Asia, already qualified for the World Cup, the sources say.
Exactly. And you could have others, maybe Cuba, Haiti, Sudan, qualifying for the World Cup or definitely competing in various Olympic sports.
So how does that work? Do they just not get to come?
Well, this is where it gets interesting. There's a really critical detail in the sources that changes things. At least for one group.
Okay.
While the general ban exists, the policy itself, according to these documents, includes a very specific, explicit exception built right in.
An exception. Who's it for?
It's explicitly for, and I'm paraphrasing from the notes here, any athlete or member of an athletic team, including coaches, persons performing a necessary support role, and immediate relatives traveling specifically for the World Cup, Olympics, or similar major events.
Wow. That's incredibly specific. So the sources are telling us, even if the ban is fully in place in 26 and 28, if a country on that list qualifies, their whole team, players, coaches, staff, even maybe close family with them, they should be able to get in under this exception.
Precisely. That's what the sources indicate. They note Iran's the only one currently qualified for the World Cup from that list, but others are in contention.
Right.
And for the Olympics in 2028, where pretty much every country sends athletes across tons of sports, this exception becomes really relevant for potentially any of those 19 nations if their athletes make the cut.
Okay, that seems, reasonably clear for the athletes and the teams themselves, but here's where the sources seem to get a bit fuzzy. What about the fans? Fans from these targeted countries. The sources point out, unlike that clear carve-out for athletes, there's nothing explicit for fans mentioned in the policy. No fan exception.
And that's a huge area of ambiguity, the sources flag, a really big one. However, they do give some context about the typical fan attending these massive international events, especially the World Cup.
Right, I saw that. The sources suggest that fans following their national teams, particularly to a World Cup, they often profile a bit differently.
Oh, so?
Well, they might be part of the diaspora, living outside the restricted country already. Or maybe wealthier individuals who might even have, another passport that isn't affected by the ban.
And the sources also note, from the host country's viewpoint, a World Cup visitor is often seen as higher spending and maybe lower risk from a security angle compared to other travelers.
And Olympics visitors are described as even, what was it, higher-end clients, though fewer overall.
Yeah, fewer overall and probably a smaller percentage coming from most of those 19 countries compared to the World Cup crowds.
So, okay, even without a formal fan exception, are the sources implying that maybe the organizers or the government think the type of fan who could actually afford the tickets, the travel,
Right.
might just naturally fit a different risk profile anyway? Is that kind of the subtext here?
That seems to be part of the thinking outlined in these notes, yeah. That the practical reality for a specific fan from, say, Libya or Iran wanting to attend might be different from the general population the ban covers, even if the policy itself doesn't change for them.
Hmm. So it's more like relying on the existing individual screening process to sort it out rather than a special event pass.
It hints at that, yes, relying on case-by-case assessment, individual circumstances, perceived risk, rather than a blanket fan exception.
Okay, so given this landscape clear path for athletes, much less clear for fans, how are the big organizers themselves handling this? FIFA, LA28. What are they telling the U.S. government?
Well, the sources detail quite a bit of behind-the-scenes activity. For FIFA, they really highlight the relationship between President Infantino and President Trump.
Yeah, described by some in the sources as, quote, too close, dating back to 2018.
That's the phrase used, yes.
What does that imply? That kind of connection between a global sports head and a head of state. Is it just logistics or?
Well, the sources seem to frame it mostly through the lens of ensuring the event runs smoothly. You know, protecting FIFA's pretty massive revenue expectations from the 2026 World Cup.
Ah, okay. Money talks.
It suggests that connection gives Infantino access, like high-level access, sitting next to the Homeland Security Secretary at a White House task force meeting, for example.
So using that access to smooth over potential visa or security issues.
That's the strong implication from the sources, using those relationships to sort of navigate around potential roadblocks caused by national policy.
And what about the LA28 Olympic folks? Do the sources suggest they're doing similar things or feeling the same pressure?
The sources quote the LA28 chair, Casey Wasserman, and he sounds pretty confident, actually. Yeah, he's quoted saying it was very clear in the directive that the Olympics require special consideration. And he specifically thanked the federal government for, recognizing that unique status.
So they feel the government gets it, that the Olympics are different.
They seem to project that, yes, Wasserman's quoted saying they have great confidence in cooperation, that accommodations for the games has been the case to date, and it will certainly be the case going forward.
And the sources even mention, quiet meetings between Wasserman and Trump.
Discreet meetings, yes. The sources mention those too.
And didn't the sources also say something about a dedicated desk at the State Department just for 2028 prep?
Yes, they note a fully staffed desk exists to help with preparations. Things like potentially quick visa processing if needed.
Okay.
But and here's that key point. Again, the sources emphasized this desk seems primarily focused on helping teams get in, reinforcing that athlete exception we talked about, not really focused on general fans.
It keeps coming back to that, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Teams, okay, fans, less clear.
That's the pattern in these sources. And they also include comments from an IOC member, Nicole Hovertz, expressing every confidence in U.S. cooperation, pointing to past U.S.-hosted Olympics.
So the organizers, at least publicly, sound pretty assured, especially about the athletes and officials.
That's the impression given, yes.
Okay, last piece here. Let's zoom out. Have other host countries dealt with tricky entry rules?
Yeah.
How did they handle it? Do the sources give us any history lessons?
They do give a couple of interesting recent examples. Both Russia in 2018 and Qatar in 2022 for their World Cups use slightly different systems.
Oh, yeah. What do they do?
Basically, having a game ticket combined with a fan ID system acted as your entry permission. Sort of like a visa waiver just for the tournament period.
Huh. So buying a ticket was your key. That sounds way simpler than the usual U.S. visa process.
It streamlined the process, definitely. And the sources are clear on this, it wasn't just open borders. Both Russia and Qatar still did background checks on everyone using that system.
Ah, okay. So easier entry, but still screened.
Exactly. It was a mix of convenience and security.
And the sources also remind us, though, that no matter the system, host governments always keep the final say on who gets in.
Absolutely. That's a crucial point the sources make. They give the example of the president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko.
Right, for London 2012.
Yeah. He was denied a visa for the London Olympics, even though he was head of his country's Olympic committee at the time.
Wow.
So it shows, host nations ultimately control their borders, even for big figures linked to the event if they have security or other concerns.
Okay, wow. So we've really dug into quite a bit here. We started with the travel ban policy itself.
Identifying the countries, the stated reasons, mostly screening concerns.
And we saw that built right into the policy is that really specific exception for athletes, coaches, support staff, allowing them entry for these big events.
Yep, a clear pathway for the teams.
But, and this is the big but, the sources really highlight, there's no matching explicit exception mentioned for fans.
None written into the policy, no. Despite acknowledging that these fans, World Cup Olympics fans, often fit a different profile.
Right, maybe diaspora, wealthier, different passports, seen as higher spending, maybe lower risk.
We then looked at how the organizers are working this. FIFA, with its reported high-level connections.
And LA28 sounding quite confident, pointing to government cooperation and that State Department desk.
But again, with the focus seeming to be heavily on making sure the teams get through smoothly.
And finally, those past examples, Russia and Qatar using tickets as entry, but with checks.
And the reminder that governments like the UK with the Belarus president always have the final say on entry.
So pulling it all together, what really stands out from these sources is that stark difference, isn't it?
It really is. The clear path for athletes versus the uncertainty for fans. Fans seem reliant on maybe their individual circumstances fitting a certain profile or just the standard screening process.
Yeah, and it highlights the organizers' efforts to work within the existing policy, not necessarily change it broadly. It's that balancing act, isn't it? National security versus the whole global inclusive idea of these events.
Definitely a balancing act.
So here's the final thought, I guess. Given that explicit exception only covers teams, not fans, and knowing host nations absolutely control their borders, how might things actually play out for fans from those restricted countries come 2026, come 2028? What does whatever happens then ultimately say about that tension, the welcoming spirit versus the security needs of the host nation? Something to definitely keep an eye on as these mass events get closer.